Let me briefly introduce NAMI New Jersey to all of you. NAMI New Jersey is committed to serving New Jersey's more diverse communities. We represent the interests of all people affected by mental health conditions, regardless of their age, gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, ability, language, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. With these conversations, we aim to bring more awareness to the relationship between mental health and culture. So, we're a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to improve the lives of individuals and families affected by mental illness through education, support, advocacy, and public awareness program. We foster understanding about mental illness, confront stigma, often associated with mental health disorders. We advocate for public policies that benefits those affected by mental conditions and promotes research into the causes, treatment, and recovery in mental health disorders. So NAMI New Jersey has different outreach services. The first one is in our own voice, which is a powerful presentation that aims to change attitudes, assumption, and stereotype about people living with mental health conditions. Every time, for every presentation, to train the presenters with lived experience of mental health conditions, talk openly about their own experiences and how they have found pathway to find hope and healing. The second outreach service, which is school education program. The school education program goes to educate youth, school staff, and adults about mental health and mental illness. And the third one is Ending the Silence, which is a free evidence-based 50-minute in-person presentation designed for middle school and high school students. And for now, let me briefly introduce our multicultural outreach program. The first one is Act Now, which is a program for African American. The full name of Act Now is African American Community Together Now, which is an excited initiative on NAMI New Jersey to connect with NAMI New Jersey's African American families, which are affected by mental health conditions, connected faith community, and mental health professionals to provide culturally contempt education, support, and advocacy. Act Now goes to dispel the misconceptions surrounding mental illness and to create an anti-stigma environment for those seeking treatment. The second one is CAMHOP, which stands for Chinese American Mental Health Outreach Program in New Jersey, which is an initiative to serve individuals with lived experience of mental health conditions and their caregivers as well. We do it through support, education, and advocacy. Our free services include NAMI signature, peer-led support groups, and education programs, information and referral services, advocacy, community education workshops, and education materials in Chinese language. The third one is NAMI Español. NAMI Español is an awareness and education program developed by NAMI New Jersey to serve the Hispanic or Latino community in New Jersey. And the last one is SAMHASH, which is for South Asian mental health awareness in New Jersey. SAMHASH provide education, support, and advocacy for South Asians affected by serious mental illness, and then South Asians of Asian Indian and Pakistani origin, as well as those from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and then Maldives are welcome to seek support and information from SAMHASH. And now I would like to pass the time to our presenter to introduce themselves and research, the report they are presenting today. So may I pass the time to Wendy, Stephanie, and Andrea?
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Keely, for that wonderful introduction to all the great work that NAMI New Jersey does for the community. So wonderful to be here and a part of community with you guys and to share a little bit about our work. I'll go ahead and just share a screen just to start us off. Has a little bit of our information as well. But I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Wendy Chu. I use she, her pronouns. I am a graduate student in clinical community psychology at the University of South Carolina, and I'm one of the leaders of the AANHPI heart study, which we'll be sharing with you about today.
All right, and I'm Andrea Ng. I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And yeah, so it's really great to be with you all today. I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Yu. My pronouns are she, her. I'm so grateful and honored to be in community with you all. I'm a clinical psychology PhD candidate at UCLA and currently doing my predoctoral psychology internship at the University of Illinois, Chicago Department of Psychiatry.
Thanks, Wilson. We'll all be presenting a little bit today throughout our time. And again, we'll be saving questions for the end, but we would love to have a dialogue and conversation with you all about that. But we're going to be going over, once I'm able to share screen real quick. Wonderful. Thank you. Open this Zoom, our presentation. Wonderful. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Again, here's our introductions. Again, we're going to be talking about the lived experiences of racial trauma in the AANHPI, which stands for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, and what is radical healing. And so for today, we're going to be going over different topics. So first, I want to give a little bit of an overview of what this study was about and was it motivated by, because it's going to set the foundation for all the work that Andrea and Stephanie will also be discussing about as well. Because racial trauma is such an important topic for communities of color, we're going to start a little bit about defining what is racial trauma. What does that experience look like? And what does that experience look like specifically in AANHPIs? We'll talk about how might you measure racial trauma using different surveys or tools, especially if you're a clinician trying to understand racial trauma in different clients. And then we're going to talk about this really important framework called radical healing and why it might be relevant for AANHPIs, and relatedly talk about a study, a recent study that we did. And then finally, we're going to end on some applications. How might this research and work that we've been working on for the past 2.5 years now, how might it be relevant for you as an individual, as a friend, a family member, a sister, brother, as a therapist, whatever it might be, because I think all of this work can really touch us in different ways. And so again, I'll kick us off a little bit by talking about an overview of this study. So the AANHPI heart study, which stands for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Healing from Racial Trauma Study, was really motivated by witnessing the increase in anti-Asian AANHPI violence around 2020 and 2021 that co-aligned with the COVID syndemic. I'm sure many of us can relate in the audience as well as just witnessing the different horrific news that are happening of Asian elders being harmed, murdered, multiple crimes happening just across the nation. And so the goal of this study was to shed light on these experiences of racial trauma in AANHPIs and to really understand how do AANHPIs react and respond to this racism because it's just so pervasive. Especially now, the U.S. has a history with anti-Asian racism and discrimination, but really now it's been especially pertinent. And so what this study involved was we did a national study We recruited from multiple organizations, I think over 500 organizations and listservs and medias, including NAMI New Jersey. And we distributed a survey to AANHPIs over the age of 18 to ask them questions within surveys, but also open-ended questions where they could describe their responses of racism and how they've healed. And of course, it was really important that we rewarded everyone for their contributions and for sharing their lived experiences. And so I'm going to go a little bit over about who made up this study, and all this work wouldn't be possible without them, because again, this will be the same thing for all the following studies that we're going to talk about. So we recruited 459 AANHPIs, and these are some of the demographics that represent them. So it's a largely young adult population around the mean age of 26 years old, but it ranged from 18 to 72 years old. Largely, the participants identified as cisgender female. And as you can see, the income ranged about 30% earned an annual income of 50 to 100K. And then for education level, most people were reported having attained a high school degree, and then followed by an associate or bachelor's degree. And I want to note that all of this information will be available in a report later on that we'll send out the link to. So don't worry if you can't get this information just yet. And then regarding generation status, just to highlight the breadth and the diversity within this sample, 60% of folks identified as second generation. So they were born in the US, but they had at least one parent who was born outside of the US. Of the sample, over 30 languages were spoken, and individuals came from 47 different US states. And 37% of participants reported living in a multi-generational household, so with parents, grandparents, children. And then I really want to highlight, just the breadth of ethnicities represented as well. While 82% of the sample identified as primarily having a single ethnicity, 80% had multiple ethnicities, and 27 different ethnicities were represented. And as you can see, here's the breakdown. So largely, the most common ethnicity reported was Chinese. And we had a large proportion that had less than 1% of representation. It's really important for us to acknowledge these differences, because historically, a lot of Asian AANHPIs, their data is reported aggregated. And this study is doing that as well, which contributes to some of those aggregation concerns. But again, one of our ways to acknowledge the diversity and experiences within the AANHPI communities is to allow folks to identify what ethnicity they do, and to be transparent about that and who is included in this study. And so, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out this link to the report where some of this information is in, and then the following studies will also be included in this report. But next, I think I'll be handing it over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much. So next I'll talk a little bit more about what is racial trauma, as well as moving into what does it look like in AANHPIs, which Andrea will speak more on. So racial trauma has been really defined as the psychological, emotional, or physical harm that's caused by racism, which is often perpetrated in many forms. And what I mean by that is that race-based traumatic stress reactions can result from racism at the interpersonal level, as well as the institutional or structural level, where it can be based on a single racist encounter, or it can also be chronic and cumulative over the lifetime of sort of being subjected to racism over the course of one's life. One thing that I think is really helpful or important to distinguish is that racial trauma, sort of distinct from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, racial trauma is really seen as a normative response to the malignance of racism. So a way that folks are responding appropriately, but the racism aspect or the system of racism is sort of like the ill part of society. And it's sort of seen as that rather than a psychological disorder. Characteristically, though, racial trauma kind of has a lot of those overlapping characteristics with PTSD, including negative alterations in cognitions or thought and mood, hypervigilance, avoidance, nightmares, and somatic or other symptoms. And as mentioned sort of on the slide here, it really focuses specifically on those harms of systemic oppression, and as a result carries, historical and cultural nuances and weight as a threat to identity when it comes to racism. And here are some common symptoms of racial trauma. We see here that there's, intrusion, intrusive thoughts, for example, anger potentially related to, what happened or the course of what's been happening over the course of one's lifetime, hypervigilance or hyperawareness, looking out for signs of danger or just sort of hyperarousal of the physiological reactions and symptoms, avoidance of situations in which someone might, experience racist encounters, as well as, depression and low self-esteem, potentially as related to, again, threat to identity. And so those are all just examples of what these symptoms can look like, but, they can really look and be expressed differently across individuals. And so from our survey, we inquired about different experiences that individuals had, specific racist encounters they'd experienced, as well as how they were impacted by anti-Asian hate during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we see here just a kaleidoscope of different experiences that, respondents were willing and open, to sharing from our survey. And, these types of experiences spanned violence, racial slurs, verbal harassment, vicarious racism from anti-Asian hate crimes that they saw on the news or knew that their family members or friends had experienced. And one thing to note too is that, they're experienced throughout the lifespan from child to adulthood. We see in some of these, descriptions about being made fun of for the food that they ate, or, being sort of stereotyped in class in front of everybody. And so I'll read, for the sake of time, just one of these quotes. "Witnessing customers yell at my parents to go back to your country when they couldn't perfectly pronounce the price of an item. They kept screaming, 'Screw you Chinese people who keep taking over.'" And I read that with a lot of weight, and the fact that those, quotes can likely resonate with a lot of us in the audience. And so just want to acknowledge that, this is often a shared pain that we've all experienced in terms of the different racist experiences that we may or may not have had. And then I'll be moving it into Andrea to talk about racial trauma in AANHPIs.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Stephanie, so much for that really wonderful overview of what racial trauma looks like, especially kind of how it's different from PTSD. And so now, the question is, right, like, can we actually measure racial trauma in AANHPIs? And really, the short answer is yes, but it may not be the best. And I'll kind of explain that as we go on a little further. And I'll present results from a study that we did, or like one of the studies that came out of this project. And so so first, what you need to know is that the existing literature on racial trauma right now has primarily been led and studied by Black scholars, and these scholars have really, really paved the way for us. And like now we have a better understanding of racial trauma. And in the literature right now, we have two measures that are used primarily to assess for racial trauma. And they're listed here as the race-based traumatic stress symptom scale, which, because it's really early in the morning for me and I don't like the tongue twisters, I'm just going to call it the RBT-SSS. The second one is the racial trauma scale. And both of these have their pros, and what we kind of know about them is that both of them have been tested in samples with largely Black American individuals. And so that comes a difficulty when we're thinking about, these measures were developed with largely Black American individuals. So do they necessarily apply with AANHPIs? And of these, the one I want to talk about a little more, the one that's primarily used in the literature right now, is the RBT-SSS. So to talk a little bit more about the RBTSS, it's a measure that first asks participants to describe 3 memorable events of racism. And so here are some quotes that we pulled from our participants that they were so kind enough to share with us. So firstly, participants are asked to describe 3 memorable events of racism. After that, they are asked to select the most memorable event of the 3. If the event was negative, beyond their control, or sudden in its occurrence. And then thirdly, they're asked to rate on a scale to what extent do they experience these certain symptoms, and these certain symptoms that Stephanie kind of went over. So intrusion, depression, anger, low self-esteem, etc. So Wendy and I were kind of curious, as to like how this measure might fit with our like solely AANHPI study sample. So we ran an analysis where we basically asked the question, do the same items hang together in our sample compared to others? And what we found were mixed results. So I included the tables with all the results here, but you don't really have to look at that. The main thing that you need to know is that of the 3 benchmarks we used, 1 passed and the other 2 did not. Interestingly, though, other analyses actually showed that this measure still works. It's still reliable. We also found that the things that the top two symptoms endorsed by our sample are like primarily AANHPI samples were different than the samples of like that had predominantly Black Americans. So for example, hypervigilance was the most strongly endorsed symptom of racial trauma in a previous study. But for our study, we found that depression and physical reaction were the most strongly endorsed in our study sample. So altogether, what this kind of means is that the RBTSSS is still a reliable measure of racial trauma. However, what it says is that it just may not be the best representation of how racial trauma manifests in AANHPIs. So as clinicians, if we were to kind of like put this out and like use this as a tool, we might want to look out more for like the depression and hypervigil and physical reactions like somatic symptoms. And so a question that we're still left with then, is like that we want to explore more in the future is that, are there other experiences that are not currently captured by the RBTSS of racial trauma that's relevant for Asian Americans that's not currently captured? And so yeah, that's it for me. And now I'll let Wendy take over to talk a little bit about radical healing.
Yeah, I think I'm passing it over to Stephanie first. But who will
My bad.
No worries. Who will again introduce this concept of radical healing.
Thank you. So I'll be talking about radical healing and why it's relevant to AANHPIs. So to start, just want to acknowledge that individual therapy is absolutely, a very, very helpful, and it's evidence-based and has been shown across, multiple, thousands, probably more than that, studies to be one way of addressing healing and mental health. And, we're all clinical psychologists in training. And at the same time, there are a lot of barriers to care when it comes to sort of only valuing or, funding access to one form of healing. And, as we know, individual therapy is the dominant form of individual services that are from sort of a westernized approach. And there can be many barriers to access to individual therapy, and barriers are often structural, such as high costs and long wait times, mental health stigma in a sense, and also sort of the lack of addressing, what can contribute to that mental health stigma, who among different communities have been minoritized and sort of continue to be stigmatized, such that individual mental health treatment may not appear to be, extremely culturally appropriate or accessible to them in different ways. And that includes different things like lack of linguistically diverse providers, lack of cultural responsiveness addressed in different therapeutic approaches, and in particular, lack of evaluated treatments for racial trauma as related to our discussion today. And also, traditional individual mental health services may be insufficient when specifically addressing racial trauma, specifically given that individual therapy focuses on the individual, as well as those previously discussed barriers to services. We think there is much support in the literature for a need for more holistic approaches to healing that focuses more on the collective level, especially where racial trauma is experienced on a collective level. And we think, for example, about the COVID-19 related anti-Asian hate as a collective racial trauma event. And of course, work on racial trauma has existed, much longer prior to that. And one important framework of collective healing that we want to really talk about today is the psychological framework of radical healing, which was developed by the brilliant Dr. Brianna French and colleagues. We really want to emphasize here that this work in radical healing and racial trauma, Black scholars have really been on the forefront of this work and done amazing groundwork that, allows us to continue to be able to do this research. And so radical healing really reflects this dialectic of simultaneously acknowledging the pain of oppression as well as active resistance to it, while also allowing oneself to dream, envision, and work towards a more just and liberated future. And so the act of holding this dialectic is in itself seen as a healing process. To note that the framework is really rooted again in liberation psychology, Black psychology, ethno-political psychology, and intersectional theory. So it combines a lot of different theoretical approaches. And as seen in this figure, French and colleagues really identified 5 specific components as anchors of the radical healing framework. And this includes collectivism, identified in the figure as emotional and social support, critical consciousness, radical hope, strength and resistance, and cultural authenticity and self-knowledge. We'll describe more of the individual anchors as we move through the next couple of slides, but just to note here how we can see, from the constructs themselves, how it sort of spans this dialectic of, strength and resistance and the act of resistance and acknowledgement of oppression alongside, the radical hope piece, the envisioning of what a just future could look like. And so from this conceptualization, healing is really thought to occur when individuals are able to develop critical consciousness around their oppression and seek to resist racial trauma. I'd like to provide a quote, again, as beautifully put by French and colleagues: centering healing allows for an intentional, proactive consideration of the relationship between justice and wellness. I just thought that was such a beautiful, line from their paper. And really in this way, critical consciousness and active resistance can be seen as a proactive way of resisting racism rather than as a reactive response to racial trauma. And so, we asked in this survey for AANHPI respondents to share with us, what were their responses to anti-Asian racism, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we really saw a lot of responses that spanned these themes of radical healing, these constructs that, Dr. Brianna French and colleagues mentioned. And so to define, critical consciousness is really seen as one's capacity to critically reflect on and analyze, somebody's social condition. That's one part of it, the critical reflection piece, as well as take individual or collective action to change inequities. And so again, participants in our survey were asked these open-ended questions, and I'll read a couple of these quotes. I try to do my part to look beyond anti-Asian racism to more pressing issues such as intersectionality with other minorities and systemic injustice. So we see some of that critical reflection going on here, reflecting on, not just anti-Asian racism, but intersectional identities and intersectional oppression. I joined a collective at my school to discuss anti-racism and how we can be better advocates and allies for marginalized groups. Again, we sort of see this critical motivation coming into play here as having these discussions and starting to think and learn together as a collective about, how to address racism across minoritized groups. And then participated in several anti-discrimination minority demonstrations. So really demonstrating that critical action piece of really starting to move in directions to enact the actions that would resist racism. So next, we also saw responses that really aligned with the idea of cultural authenticity. So cultural authenticity reflects the idea of returning to our ancestral roots to resist colonized knowledge and practices as the only way of doing and knowing. So really valuing and honoring our ancestral wisdom and cultural teachings. And what this could look like, maybe turning to practices and values and cultural history and strengths that reflect that cultural authenticity, rather than sort of, solely aligning yourself with values that may not actually be your own values, but are sort of more represented in a colonized society. And living authentically in this way is really seen as an act of resistance. Again, we see these illustrated in individuals' responses about, how they reacted or how they responded to anti-Asian racism. So consuming art, food, and history about my ethnic group has been healing. Such a beautiful call to radical healing. And actually, we didn't ask specifically about radical healing at all. So beautiful that they sort of saw that as a way of healing for themselves. I joined an Asian group that aimed towards mentoring other Asians. From there, I created illustrations with mental health resources for Asian Americans specifically, and other social justice initiatives for other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to look at. So really turning to their skills and illustrations, as well as a bit of that critical action here as well, but sort of all in, in this foundation of honoring cultural authenticity.
All right, and now going into radical hope. So radical hope is a concept that essentially describes, like, again, this collective belief within marginalized communities that the future, essentially like the future prospects for their communities include healing and transformation against oppression, ultimately leading towards like a more fair future. And really said another way, it's a really deep rooted belief that in spite of the history of oppression, that the current oppression that we're facing, that there is hope for a just future, no matter how far away it is. And a couple of our participants had actually again illustrated that in their responses. So, one person said, like, I have promoted educational materials, infographics, etc. And having this knowledge also gives me hope that these times will pass and the frustration come from a place of collective fear. And another participant said, I just hope for equality and for everyone to respect each other, especially within the greater Asian diaspora in the US. And so that kind of shows kind of a little bit of that like individual sense of hope for kind of like a better future, ultimately, when the world can kind of look like a really dark and scary place. Next is collectivism and care, and this really refers to how individuals provide and or receive emotional and social support. And this was actually so evident in a lot of our responses. And I think it just really shows so much about how being united with like family, with like our relationships are so important in AANHPI cultures. And because it was really evident, and it was really interesting to see that a lot of our participants, we asked how they responded, and a lot of them didn't really talk very much about how they specifically responded, but they instead talked about how they felt pulled towards taking care of their loved ones. So for example, a participant said, being in a safe space to talk about anti-Asian racism, sharing information and safety protocols to our elders. I have brought my friends and coworkers pepper spray and spread awareness of the dangers in the community, and also just became more proactive in bystander intervention. So we just see a lot of that, like taking care of each other in this time of need. And lastly, we have strength and resistance, which essentially involves communities uplifting themselves to live authentically and building this collective resilience in the face of racial oppression. So one thing to know is that strength, and in order to have a sense of strength and resistance, radical hope is a requirement. So one thing that is really interesting, and I think I really respect about this framework, is that they recognize that all of these aspects are all interconnected with one another. They're not entirely separated and like yeah, like exclusive from one another. So yeah, strength and resistance, as you can see from the quotes, I've become more hopeful having seen the AAPI community stand together during these times, and it's also been inspiring to see everybody come together and take a stand. So strength and resistance refers more to this collective sense of hope in a way.
All right, so I'll be closing it off with one of our final studies that we'll be talking today. And this study really aimed to look at things quantitatively. I think qualitative research and hearing about the lived experiences in the words and voices of the participants is so rich. And the field has also valued quantitative research and moving forward some of these constructs. And so we really want to examine, is racial trauma associated with radical healing in AAPIs through this quantitative study? And so what that looked like was that we conducted a linear regression, a multivariate linear regression, and examined whether racial trauma symptoms, as reported by the sample, using the RBTSSS, many letters, and its association with the different constructs of radical healing. And so for each of the different constructs, we had a different measure. As you can see here, we broke out critical consciousness into different constructs, which includes reflections about inequality, reflections about an egalitarian future, critical motivation, and this sociopolitical participation and critical action as well. And so for this, we really hypothesized that when an AAPI and ANHPI experiences racial trauma symptoms, they're going to be pulled to engage in radical healing. Again, knowing the systemic barriers to traditional individual services that Stephanie already discussed. And so that we hypothesize that greater racial trauma symptoms will be associated with engaging in greater radical healing. And so, what do we find? So we found that racial trauma was positively associated with some of the radical healing constructs. Specifically, more racial trauma symptoms was associated with increased cultural authenticity, increased critical motivation, sociopolitical participation, collectivism, and radical hope. In the study, we didn't find that racial trauma was associated with strength and resistance, critical reflection about inequality, and egalitarianism. And so, taken together, what does this mean? This specific study, the quantitative study, really demonstrated, and was one of the first studies to show that racial trauma is associated with some constructs of radical healing in AANHPIs and specific constructs of radical healing as well. This also leaves a lot of questions for future research and future implications, though. Because we didn't find some significant associations, statistically significant associations, we might think there might be further opportunity to examine, is racial trauma related to strength and resistance? Strength and resistance is a really complex, construct and experience. So really diving into that. How do folks define strength and resistance, right? And it also probes additional questions about, is racial trauma related to critical reflection, and how is it so? Seems like in the qualitative responses, some folks were engaging in some of that reflection about recognizing the injustices that the AANHPI community experiences, but also those of other marginalized communities. So I think further inquiring into that would be a really interesting area. And then as again, as clinical psychologist trainees, I think it's really important to consider, again, both the individual and especially the community level interventions that we need to have to address racial trauma symptoms. And also, how do we promote radical healing in individual and community level interventions? And so lastly, given the diversity of the sample that we've had in AANHPI experiences, there might be opportunities in the sample to further understand when AANHPIs would lean into some anchors of radical healing more, or if certain groups of AANHPIs would lean into radical healing more than others. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie now to wrap us up with some applications.
Thanks so much. So across the board, we, have some suggestions around, what are the implications of this work and how to apply them. And so the slide sort of demonstrates what can be done broadly, and I'll talk a little bit alongside that in terms of just applications, maybe like clinically, at the community level as well as at the structural level. So in terms of, the individual, as well as, what therapists and providers can think of, is really elevating individuals' awareness of radical healing and the things that one can do, if its values aligned for that individual and feasible and, safe to resist racism and move towards healing in the ways that feel most appropriate for them. And, individual therapy also is a natural opportunity to integrate radical healing practices into their care. And so clinicians can support AANHPIs in instilling or fostering radical hope, for example, seeking community connection, and taking critical action, again, in values-aligned ways, regardless of theoretical orientation or the intervention itself used. And individuals themselves, as well as clinicians, can explore with clients on an individual basis what a culturally authentic life may look like for them, as well as reinforce those behaviors or positive behaviors where individuals can become attuned with or in touch with their ancestral practices and knowledge. And again, this is sort of broadly speaking, and at the same time, we also want to acknowledge that different individuals may be in a different place for what this means to them. And so, it may not be what somebody wants to do in that moment or in that, time period or wherever. And so just recognizing, the span of, where someone may be in terms of what authenticity or cultural authenticity looks like for them, and just being very aware or intentional around that. In terms of the community level, what this really speaks to is the importance of, collective or community interventions. And, there's a lot of organizations, grassroots organizations that mobilize around sociopolitical action in AANHPIs, building more of that radical hope, as well as the critical motivation and opportunity to take action, again, if that feels aligned with their values and if advocacy and sociopolitical participation is something that, not only, involves pushing back against the system, but may also align with what that individual, fully needs to sort of maintain that radical hope. And doing so in a way that is collective, right? Taking collective action with others with shared values and interests and advocacy. Local AANHPI-centered programs and events, and really funding those that can foster a collective sense of community, as well as build solidarity within and among other minoritized communities. Having local and state level support for these functions and funding these, types of events and programs is really, really essential for, from every aspect of entry. I'm thinking about, the youth that can be really helped with these types of organizations and are helped, as well as, throughout the lifespan, what it means to be able to be a part of programs and events that center on, your culture or identity that really values and validates your culture and identity. And of course, we've spoken a lot about, radical healing on the collective and community and individual level. And of course, it is not at all lost on us that at the end of the day, racism is the root cause of racial trauma, right? And systemic interpersonal racism and how, systemic racism trickles down to the interpersonal interactions. And at the end of the day, that holds the most weight when it comes to racial trauma. And it shouldn't be only on minoritized communities to learn and, heal, right? At the end of the day, it would be best if racism didn't happen. And, structurally, policies really have to align in order to address that root cause, and as well as promote radical healing among AANHPIs and other minoritized communities. And, for example, there are certain states that have codified AANHPI history into like secondary education curricula, which really can promote that self-knowledge in youth, as well as sort of, increase awareness, among other communities as well. And I think a lot about, how much that resonates with me to have had, curriculum that's really focused on AANHPI history, as well as, histories among, shared minoritized or oppressed groups and what that could look like and what that would have meant to me as a kid. As well as thinking about how anti-hate crime legislation can, increase just awareness as well as consequences for, being the perpetrator of a hate crime, while also thinking about, not thinking about how to navigate that without increased policing being the answer, which we know negatively impacts Black and Brown communities. And so, thinking through those structural solutions for really targeting the root cause of racial trauma alongside, what communities have had to do for centuries in terms of, radical healing and resistance.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, I'll wrap us up before we move into the Q&A portion. Just want to thank you again for sitting through lunch, listening to us share some findings from this study, which we've learned so much about, and truly, again, to these 459 AANHPIs in the U.S. who without whom all this work would not have been possible, and who were brave enough to share their lived experiences of racism and how they have healed from it. So I want to acknowledge Andrea and Stephanie, who have been amazing and really supporting this work, and all of our research assistants and colleagues as well, who have contributed to this work. Again, our contact information here, which we'll be able to send out, and as well as the link to the report, which includes some of this information. But I'll go ahead now and stop sharing screen so I can see all of my co-presenters as well now. And so I've been looking at the Q&A, the questions that have been coming into the chat, and I was just personally so excited to see these amazing questions, come up, and it really makes me hopeful that, we have folks in the community who are asking the exact questions that we want to see and the right changes. And so I want to respect the anonymity of folks who submitted the questions. So I won't ask or require folks to unmute to ask their questions, but of course, if they want to, they definitely can. But I was thinking how we could kind of tackle some of these questions is we can read out the question, the anonymous question out loud, and then potentially we can discuss as presenters some of our ideas or reflections and responses. It doesn't have to be one of us takes one or the other, or if we all want to, chime in either way. And then I think one of the beautiful thing about, these webinars and these, again, conversations is to engage in conversations with folks. So feel free to type in reactions or your thoughts in the chat, as well as we just engage in dialogue about these really important questions. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and read the first question, if that makes sense. We have 10 minutes. Sounds great. I think we can get through most of them. I wish we could spend even a whole hour engaging in these wonderful conversations. But again, feel free to contact us afterward as well if you have further questions that we aren't able to answer today. But the first question asks, how do you all conceptually and operationally make a distinction between race and culture, given that many conflate both as being synonymous with one another? And this is, again, a great question, and completely agree that many people do think race and culture is synonymous. And so for me personally, how I think about culture is it's really tied to a social identity such as race. But culture in itself is a set of beliefs, values, or traditions within a social identity that can change over time, be passed through generations, can be experienced within one's lifetime. And when we think about cultural identities, these really get into the specific social identities that folks have. It could be by race. It could be by LGBTQ status. It could be by living condition. It could be by SES or income. It could be whether you're a first generation college student. All of these are different social identities that people may have, and they may influence the different cultures that they experience. And I think also for many, many folks, it impacts it in a very intersectional way, right? People don't have just one specific, a set of beliefs, tradition, or values. Very few people, do. And I think it's these, intersectional experiences of different cultures that manifest into our lived experiences that many BIPOC folks experience. So I think race is just it's a specific social identity of culture. I think you might think about culture as a kind of a broad aspect of just these values and beliefs and traditions, but race and racial identity is just one specific way that one might experience culture. But I think it's a really, really great question. Do our co-presenters have any thoughts about that one?
Maybe we can move to the second question. Do you want me to read it out, or when do you want to read it out?
Yeah, of course. Yes. I can definitely read it out. And again, my co-presenters could feel free to chime in. But the second one is, what do you believe is needed to move past westernized conceptualizations of therapy to more somatic and decolonized practices that meet the needs of historically marginalized populations?
I absolutely love this question, and I'm happy to answer this one. And of course, others should definitely chime in with their thoughts as well. I absolutely love this question, and I think a lot about sort of, how much. Earlier in the slides, we talked about this idea of like ways of knowing, and how, certain ways of knowing are valued and others are not, and how much, ways of knowing is gate kept, and how much science as a construct or idea or process is gate kept. And rather than, only valuing, what's written on paper, right, the written word, or only valuing, what's, scientifically gone through this process of, test and experiment, which of course, we're researchers alongside, our clinical psychologist identities, that's of high value. And at the same time, recognizing that lived experiences, what communities bring to us, with their ancestral wisdom, what they've practiced for years and years and years that have worked for them, those are ways of knowing, those are expertise, those are science. Like, I think recognizing and valuing those lived experiences as, just as equally valuable as, what's written in papers and scientific studies is one way to really think about how we can decolonize, psychology as a field, as well as, practices and therapeutic practices that can move beyond sort of, the one-to-one relationship and more into collective and community level practices. And again, that's not at all to say that, therapy isn't amazing and great, for the folks that can access it and, receive, great practices and are validated, and, for providers who can really engage in culturally responsive ways. But, it is just one way of acknowledging and assisting the healing process. And, just as it's important to have many different, skills and strategies in therapy, it's really important to have different kinds of ways of healing, and for those to be recognized, validated, supported, funded, so that individuals and communities can have access to them. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that a little bit. I feel like what Stephanie is saying is so important. I feel like it really captures the sense of just like having an open mind and like having a sense of humility, like, and as we navigate our world, whether or not we're just like just a person, or whether we're acting in a clinician role or as a researcher, right? Just having a sense of humility, I think, is so important. And I think with that too is like also engaging in conversations, engaging in finding ways to educate ourselves and having open conversations about things like this. Attending webinars like this, is one way of moving forward this work, because we really only know things that we're taught, right? That are talked about, and I think doing things in this way is one way to move it forward.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Stephanie.
Sorry, one more thing I wanted to add from Andrea's comment as well. I thinking a lot about who is in the room, right? Who is being amplified in the discussions around, either like clinical work, intervention, as well as research, all the things that really contribute to, at the end of the day, like what, individuals and communities have access to in terms of, different types of programs and services, right? So, oftentimes, communities are not at the helm of that. And I think that's, something that really needs to change, right? Thinking about communities as co-leaders alongside, who the change makers are, who are making the decisions in the room, whether it's researchers or different, policy makers, and all of that. I think it's really, really important to not only amplify, communities' voices, but also, they should have an equal seat at the table, really, in leading this work.
Absolutely. And I think I'll, respond to that and answering the question that Alicia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, dropped in the chat. And also I'll transition into our next question, but just bouncing off these conversations of what does it mean to practice cultural humility, especially when working, with someone who may come from a different culture that's different than ours, because chances are that is for sure going to happen. That's going to be a certainty. As clinicians, you're going to be working with someone who has different experiences. And it's absolutely a balance and a process, right? It's not a one-time competence, right? This sounds good. I know you have to wrap up, and we'll try to answer the responses. Maybe that we can send out in an email afterward. But I think this, aspect of cultural sensitivity and responsiveness is just so important, right? It's never you are competent and you are done, and that you can continue to move on, right? But it's really this process of, as you mentioned, Alicia, learning about, a client, and even before learning, recognizing what are those differences, right? Doing that intentional introspection about how is your culture different from that your clients? How might that impact your worldviews about how you might see things? And then engaging in that learning process, from that culturally humble stance that I don't know everything and I want to learn in order for me to understand and how to best navigate healing, what it means for you. But I think it's such, a wonderful question that we should always continue to ask with any client. How can we be culturally responsive to someone who is seeking services from us? Yes, self-reflectivity, absolutely. But again, I love all these questions, and I wish we could again have a whole hour discussion or webinar just engaging in these conversations. I think these questions give you the most life and excitement, and how we can transform the field and the structural changes that need to happen. But I'll pass it over to Hulu, who I think will be closing us.
Thank you, Wendy, Stephanie, and Andrea, for giving us such a meaningful presentation and sharing. And then for the rest of the questions, we will email all the questions to our presenters and then get back to all the participants later through email. Okay, thank you for all the comments and questions. Before we go, I would like to share some related resources with all of you. Especially the first one, everyone can download the report directly from the link. And then we just share it one more time in the chat box for everyone's convenience. Right, so here all the participants can download the report. And then the second link will about what is radical healing. Okay. And then if you don't like write down the link as we don't have enough time. Like you can find the recording on the NAMI New Jersey webpage and also on the YouTube later on. Okay, so the third link is what is racial trauma. Okay, if you want to have a revision or link to today's presentation or related information, you can probably find more information through this link. Okay. And also, I would like to share you the link, the webpage of NAMI New Jersey and the NAMI as well. Okay. For the individual counseling services, participants may find more information through the Psychology Today website and then the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. All right. Okay. So everyone is welcome to get into NAMI New Jersey's website, and then you will see the Get Involved page. I mean, the Get Involved button on the top of the page, and you can become a member of NAMI New Jersey. Then you can learn how, you can learn more about our programs, and then all our programs are free. And you'll be able to find where our statewide online support groups are and information about our affiliate support groups, multicultural programs, and all the signature programs as well. Okay, if you want to stay connected with us, you're very welcome to, and then please subscribe to our newsletter as well. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, a survey will be emailed to you tomorrow. Please feel free to give us any feedback and comments. Okay, thank you again, Wendy, Andrea, and Stephanie for sharing this hour, spending this hour with us today. And then thank you all the participants for joining us for the webinar today. Okay, this is the end of our multicultural conversation, and then I'm hoping to see you again very soon.